This is Revelation Response, a podcast where we talk about who God is, what He's done in our lives, and how we can't help but respond in worship. We want these episodes to be an encouragement wherever you are on your faith journey, to pay attention to what God is saying to you and to consider how you might respond. Now, here's my conversation with Rob Howard. Hey, welcome back to the podcast. I'm Nate Souza, your host, and today I've got Rob with me. Thanks for coming on, Rob.
Yeah, glad to.
So we work together, and for folks that don't know, tell them your role and kind of how we got to know each other and all that stuff.
Yes, I work at Fellowship Bible Church, and I've been there for 17 years. I was hired in 2005 as part of our worship ministry, and then in 2006 became our worship pastor. And I served as our worship pastor for 8 or 9 years, and then kind of slowly began this transition into broader leadership. And to where today my role is, I'm one of our executive pastors, and I oversee our weekend ministries, which is worship, teaching, kids, students, our family ministry as well as in that kids and students and marriage. And then I oversee the things that we do for our body that are spiritual formation related. Mm-hmm. So that's my role these days.
I actually have a question on that. So like when you started doing worship, did you think I'd like to do this sort of job that you're doing now back then? Or was it kind of like along the way, you just sort of morphed with change as it came sort of thing?
Yeah, right. Good question. Because, I would say that before I worked at Fellowship, I worked in Christian music publishing, and I knew I wanted to do that. I worked for Word Music for 10 years. And but the whole time I was there, I served a church part-time as a worship pastor. And I knew that someday I'd be full-time with a church. That was just something that I knew in my spirit, and I didn't know when that would be or how that would be. And so when we sat for a year and a half as just part of the body, we just fell in love with Fellowship, and I knew that's where I needed to be. And when a job opened up, I was all in. And then, when you're there for a long time, roles change, people change, responsibilities come and go. And so it just naturally moved into different leadership there. But I always knew that I'd be with a church. I just always felt that was God's kind of call on my life.
One of the ways I feel your impact on the staff the most is your pastor heart, like how you help us think through prayer, and when you've shared in staff meetings about how to connect with God, like all this stuff. I think it's a result of, well, maybe you can talk a little bit about your the Lipscomb thing and kind of, how that shaped your pastoring and what you do at Fellowship.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've always had compassion, a kindness in my heart toward people and their relationship with God. And at one point, the opportunity came. One of our teaching pastors, Lloyd Shadrach, said, there's an opportunity for you at Lipscomb. They do these kind of 2-year cohorts. And he said, I think it would be a great place for you to grow. And so the idea was spiritual direction, which I'd never heard of, but really that is helping someone pay attention to their relationship with God and then respond to God and their awareness of Him just in everyday life. I did that cohort for 2 years, that program, and I really grew in curiosity, asking good questions, kind of introspection, and paying attention and trusting the Holy Spirit in me in the middle of conversations or in the middle of what I'd be saying. And, that points to my story, which I know we're going to talk about, where for most of my life, I had to get everything perfect. And I trusted myself, and I could count on myself. And so the idea of letting go of that to trust what the Spirit wants me to say was a new thing.
Yeah.
And so, I do think that that's part of my role to bring, but boy, that's a part of who I am.
Yeah.
And I think the more that I learned and was comfortable with who I am, not who I wanted people to see me to be, the more I'm okay bringing that kind of piece of myself.
Yeah, it's such a gift, I think, to our staff. So thanks for allowing God to use you that way. Yeah. So, I mean, you mentioned your story. It's a story I've heard you tell in different settings, with men's groups or a little bit with the staff, that kind of thing. And so there was something that came up in your life. You kept noticing it and you had to name it eventually. So take us back to the beginning and what was happening.
Well, so I'd been at Fellowship 7 years. So this is, I guess, maybe 10 years ago or a little more now. I had a sabbatical come up, and I had a month off, and I wanted to grow in that month off. And I remember going to Lloyd, who I was reporting to him at the time, and I said, what could I do to grow as a leader while I'm on this sabbatical? And which is interesting in itself because a sabbatical is a rest. I mean, it can be used for study and growth, but it didn't even enter my mind that I would use it for rest. I was like, okay, here's an opportunity for me to grow, and I'm going to work hard at something. And that was a theme that we...
it's like a work vacation.
Yep. That was a theme that was that really came through on the sabbatical. But he said, well, really, if you want to grow as a leader, you need to work on your heart. And I just, I totally trust him. I was like, okay. And he said, we'd love to send you to Colorado for a week and work with this counselor and coach that's out there. And really, I think looking back, what I heard is, we'd love to send you to Colorado for a week. And I went, well, of course.
Yeah.
Like, I love Colorado.
Where do I sign?
Right. And I get there, and I mean, I can remember this like it was yesterday. So I sit down on this guy's couch, and I'm just chattering. I'm telling him about how I'd fixed my email to where if you emailed me, you got a response that said, I'm on sabbatical, this is going to be deleted. And so I wouldn't have to come back to 1,000 emails. I'd just, come back to him. And he goes, oh, how interesting. Why is it so difficult for you to unplug? And that was like the thread that unraveled everything. Huh. And, I think I think I tried to answer him. And I think probably what came out was, well, I have work to do. I'm responsible for these things, and responsibility has always been a capital R for me, capital R responsibility. And people are counting on me, and I hold up too big a piece of the sky. And so there was this heavy sense of responsibility and work and doing. And I remember he said, well, where does that sense of doing come from? And, I remember talking to one of our pastors on staff years ago about that. And, I'd be emailing at 10 o'clock at night about a worship planning thing, and he'd email right back, quit emailing. What are you doing?
Yeah. And,
he said, what you call your good Midwestern work ethic is really workaholism. And I didn't know what to do with that. And, because hard work's a good thing.
Yeah.
And being responsible is a good thing. And, there was a busyness about me that really, when I look back at it, and what I started to learn then was it was this compulsive busyness. And I'm a perfectionist, and everything should be right. And, it's like, of course, with this counselor, we went back to my childhood, and I wanted to be a good kid. And I was a good kid, and I wanted to please my parents, and I wanted to please my teachers. And then as I grew, it's like I wanted to please my bosses, and I wanted to please God. And so, I think that sense of doing came from a good place as a kid who really wanted to try hard and please people. And so as we're talking about that, I mean, literally, Nate, this is like 30 minutes in, and he said, well, tell me about your relationship with your father. And I remember thinking, oh, well, I'm not going to be sitting on a counselor's couch crying about my relationship with my dad, because my dad was a really good dad. Yeah. And so I could just go, well, yeah, I mean, my dad was, like my best friend. Like and my dad had passed away. He passed away when I was 29 or 30 from a brain tumor. So he's, now 24 years, I think it's been that he's been gone. But I said, oh, we do things together. We play golf together all the time, or we go hunting together, or we go fishing together. And he's like, okay, tell me more. And it's like, well, we go to Royals baseball games. I grew up in Kansas City, big baseball fan. Or we'd go to football games, or go on campouts. And he's like, what else? And like, and then I'm struggling to think of what float trips.
Yeah. And we did a lot together.
And he said, it sounds like you had a side-by-side relationship with your dad. And I was like, well, yeah. Like, it was awesome.
Yeah.
And he goes, I bet it was, but it's not all you needed as a kid. And he said, you also needed a face-to-face relationship with your dad. And I'm like, what do you mean? He's like, well, your dad's sitting across from you and holding up the mirror to you and saying, this is who you are. This is who I see you to be. You are a compassionate person. You are a kind person. And that's beautiful. And God's going to use that. And I just remember bawling my eyes out over that. And I called my wife, maybe we went for probably a couple hours. So mid-morning, I called my wife. She's like, how's it going? So, well, you're not going to believe this. I'm 30 minutes in. I'm crying about my dad. And she's like, your dad? Right. And I'm like, yeah. And she's like, are you kidding me? Like, your dad was incredible.
Yeah.
And he was. And, it's like, it makes me think of myself as a father. I have 3 kids. And I have tried so hard to raise my kids well. And I hope I've done a better job than my dad. And my dad would say, I hope you have too. And he did a better job than his father. And I hope my kids do a better job than I did. And, but I'm not their perfect heavenly father. Like I will fail my kids, and I have failed my kids. And so anyway, it's like it revealed this, how he classified side-by-side relationship with my dad. So to be with my dad in relationship, we do things together. And I was like, that makes perfect sense. Yeah. I had some assignments that night, and I remember that night it was like, is there anything you need to say to your dad? And of course, I couldn't with him. He had died. And so I sat there for a long time kind of thinking, I don't have anything to say. And then as I was driving back from this place I was up in the mountains, like sitting by this lake, these words started coming out of me, like, to my dad. And, it was like, you did such a good job as my father. You did the very best that you could. You didn't know any better. You did so much more for me than your dad did for you. It was this grace and forgiveness of, okay, so you missed me. And in some way that shaped my life in really good ways and in not so good ways. Because, I think that, when I didn't quite know who I was or was okay with who I was, then I always tried to be enough for everybody around me. And that came very naturally to a good kid. And so there was this grace and forgiveness that poured out of, that was that night or the next day or something, where it was just, you did the best you could, and you didn't know any better, and you gave me the very best that you could. And so as we kind of went through that week, we got into, okay, tell me what your relationship with God is like. And, it was very quickly I was able to say, well, I wanted to be enough for God. I wanted to be good enough for God. And I wanted to do enough for God. And I wanted him to be pleased with me. And it was all that same language of, I wanted to be a good kid. And I wanted God to be pleased with me. And I remember one time, we were in a setting with several worship pastors in the room, and a guy was talking with us, and he just asked the question, what do you think the Father's thoughts are toward you? And I remember answering, oh, I think sometimes he's kind of like, are you kidding me? I mean, seriously, this again? And I remember somebody else in the room said, oh, I think he loves me. Like, I know that he is, like, I'm his beloved, and he cares for me deeply. And the guy who was talking with us said, really, there's only 2 ways to answer that. Either God's a little frustrated with you, or God absolutely adores you. Right. You're his beloved. And so I think that I carried that, I got to do better for God with me. And so, when I think about being good enough for God or doing for God, what I realized is, like the side-by-side relationship I had with my dad, I had a side-by-side relationship with Jesus. Like, to be in relationship with Jesus, I did things for him. I served him. I worked part-time in a church while I was working full-time for a Christian publishing company, which was ministry. And there wasn't downtime. We needed to be busy and doing good for God. And so it was just this compulsiveness to be enough for God and to relate to God in that side-by-side relationship. the question was, well, what would it be like for you to have a face-to-face relationship with God? And I didn't know.
Yeah.
And the assignment for me that night, and it was later on the week, maybe like Thursday, we started on Monday, and he said, I want you to go home and say anything you need to say to God. And man, Nate, I sat there for a long time, just staring at the wall, going, I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know even, I don't know what I should say to God.
Because that was a huge shift, I think, at that point, right? To say, what would that even look like? What's the difference?
Yeah.
Like if you had been doing that your whole life, the side-by-side thing, it's like describe the face-to-face. I can imagine just going like, what?
Yeah. Oh,
Like, that's
exactly.
confusing,
And
yeah.
that's what he was pressing me into. And it's
Yeah.
like, I didn't know how to look God in the eyes and say.
Yeah.
And so I sat there for a long time. And then it was just, it was one of those moments where, it's like people say, do you hear God talk to you? And I believe that I do. And I've never heard God say in a physical voice anything to me, but it's an impression or a thought that comes into my mind that I know is not mine. And I feel like God said to me that night the words that I said to my dad. And it was just like what was coming into my mind was, you did the best you could. You didn't know any better. You really tried your hardest. You gave me the best that you could give me.
Yeah.
And there was just like the grace and forgiveness that I'd given to my dad. I just felt God giving that grace and forgiveness to me of, thank you for trying so hard. Like I see that and it was beautiful. And there's more. And so, there was just like, I want to say that's the first time I really felt grace, but that sounds silly because I know I was a believer.
Yeah.
But the experience with God was just so freeing that I didn't have to prove myself to him.
How some of that strikes me just by hearing you describe all that is there's nothing inherently wrong with side-by-side relationship. Like I think about good memories, and formative years, and that connection that you can have shoulder to shoulder or side by side is not inherently bad.
No.
But it's almost like the comparison of it's not like you want to get rid of that. It's like adding on.
Exactly.
We're side by side, and there was moments I needed to turn inward with my dad and say, hey, what do you think about me? Like, encourage me, or like even mutually at that point, hey, Dad, I love you. Like, you're doing a good job. Just that things that would be awkward side by side that necessarily happen when you're face to face. You know?
Absolutely. And that's so true. And it took me a while to really get that because, one's not right and the other wrong. They're both right. Like we need them both.
Yeah. And
kind of the best way to describe that is, to think of the infinity loop and, those two circles that are interjoined.
Yeah.
And that's a healthy balance. And so you can think about that as side by side and face to face. We need both of that.
Right.
And another label that we could put on that is being and doing.
Yeah.
And so, I would describe that the way I went into that sabbatical, those two circles were way out of balance. Like the doing circle was so big and that being circle was so small.
Gotcha. Okay.
And so, it's really John 15. And, Jesus is talking about abide in the vine. And in John 15:5, he says, I am the vine, you are the branches. Whoever abides in me and I in him, he it is that bears much fruit, for apart from me, you can do nothing. So, imagine that doing side for me was so big. I was trying to do everything that I could, but I wasn't abiding in the vine. I wasn't abiding with Christ. And really what happens is that doing flows out of the being. So when that being was so small, I was so unhealthy. And that was the compulsiveness, the workaholism, the perfectionism. And I didn't allow my doing to flow from my being. And so in a sense, I didn't know how to be in relationship with Jesus apart from the doing.
Yeah. I feel like that for me, that doing side, if I'm trying to prove myself to God or like be the good Christian dude, I'm usually doing that outside of the vine. Like I'm doing it on my own,
Sure.
and then I come back and show God, like I think about my sons, like, look what I made. Look what I
did for you.
I was off here by myself doing all this stuff. I come back and show God, aren't you proud of me? That I've never read that passage in that way, about your doing can be completely isolated from God, which isn't good doing at all. Like he's saying you actually can't do anything outside of the vine, and I think I can a lot of the times, it's like your doing should be a result of being with me. That's where it happens.
Well, go back to what we were saying about, trusting and depending on the Spirit. And, I really trusted myself to think up what we needed to think up creatively, to make it happen, to dot all the I's, cross all the T's, not drop a detail. I really trusted myself to do that. And that was just that overworked, compulsive doer that wasn't attached to the vine, trusting the Spirit in me to lead me to what he wanted for me or what he wanted me to do. So that was the big revelation for me, was the being and doing. And if my doing was so out of control in some sense, and my being was so small, what was I going to do about it?
Sometimes people can see a big problem in their life. Like I just got this thing I got to take care of. Like this is eating me alive. Was it like that for you? Or it almost seem to catch you off guard a little bit? Like you're just taking a sabbatical, you're sitting down with this guy. Was it a little bit of a surprise going, whoa, side by side, face to face? Like,
no.
Or did you know that was there symptoms of a problem?
Well, I think once I decided I wanted to grow, I couldn't help but grow. And I think I see that in people, like the people who want to grow, they're going to grow.
Yeah.
I've seen it over and over in all these years working with people. If you want to grow, you're going to grow. And I think, so the sabbatical was part of that. It was almost that the moment that it all came together. But when I looked back from that moment, I could see a lot of roads leading me to that place. Like one of the reasons I quit that part-time job that I'd served a church in East Nashville for 9 years as their worship pastor. And while I was full-time and I was married, we had young kids, and I was absolutely exhausted. And I didn't know what to do about that. And I couldn't let that job go. Like I couldn't resign because I was doing that for God. Like that was important kingdom work. I would say I was holding up a big piece of the sky there. And, I remember my mom talking to me on the phone. I remember where I was in our neighborhood when I was driving my car. And she said, do you think you need to let go of that job? And it was like, I cannot believe you just said that. Like I was so shocked. That thought would have never crossed my mind. But, it was like that. I was so unhealthy. It was affecting stress. I had to go to the doctor because my heart rate was so high. Wow. And he was like, nothing's wrong with your heart. And my doctor was a believer. And he's like, let's talk about what's going on in your life. And it was the stress that had built up from all I was doing. So things like that, or the story of that guy at the table saying, what are your father's thoughts to you? Or the pastor on staff at Fellowship who said, Rob, really your good Midwestern work ethic is really called workaholism. Like those things, I was aware of those things, but I didn't know what to do with them. I didn't know what help I needed, and I didn't know.
That makes sense.
Because when you think about it, like hard work's a good thing.
Yeah.
And we're taught to work hard, and we want to do our best. Why wouldn't we want to do a good job? And I'm a punctual person. Like, what's wrong with showing up on time? But, there was this compulsive side to all of that pointed to something deeper that I was unaware of that was going on.
Can you say more about compulsive? What is that? I mean, I know that word, but how are you using that? What was compulsive about it?
I had created an identity, and my identity is I am what I do. And so I'm a hardworking, good person. Yeah. And I wanted people to see that. And so there was a compulsivity that would have to keep up that mask for everybody to see.
Yeah.
And so, I was a perfectionist that would come through. I would fix what's broken. I would solve the problem. I would get it done. And there was there was the compulsive side of that was I have to keep up that identity because that's who people know me to be. I am what I do. I'm that person who does those things. And so it's like, I would say that's a mask that I created that I held up to people and how I wanted to be seen. And then I realized, that I also hold that mask up to God and afraid to let him see me or others see really the mess that I could be, the sinful person, the failure. And, I think if I am what I do, then I couldn't fail.
Yeah. What happens if you don't go to a job?
if I am what I do and I fail, then I'm a failure.
Yeah.
And so I couldn't let that happen. And so, then everything had to be perfect. Everything spoke to who I was. And so if I'm not just what I do, then who am I?
Wow.
And that gets back to a little bit of you're compassionate, you're kind, you're a grace giver, whatever. I didn't know who I was in some sense. And so I didn't want to be a failure, so I couldn't fail. And that was a compulsivity.
Gotcha.
But then if I'm not what I do, who am I? Well, my identity is I'm a child of God and he loves me and adores me. And that shift began to happen the more I learned to sit with God, was hear those words for me and be able to relax some of that compulsivity.
Yeah. So this is a big turning point in terms of like, I know all this now. I see this. I see the difference between side to side, face to face. What do I do about this? How do I access this? Like, is that kind of where you start looking into how do I guess fix this is the wrong way to, how do I mend this relationship or change it?
Well, right. And it was, okay, what am I going to do about this? And so, I think that then the work that was ahead of me after that week intensive was I need to learn to take the mask down and be vulnerable with the people around me that love me and with God. And then learn to bring my full true self, my full self to him, bring what's in the dark out and set it on the table and talk to him about it rather than trying to cover it up. Let him know my thoughts, my emotions, my desires, my choices, that language, bring that fully to God. So it's like I had to learn to be in relationship with God. And then I also needed to relax that doing to a healthier level to where if you think of those two circles where they balanced out and the doing could flow from that being. And so really I had to learn how to be with God, be in relationship with God face to face. At that point, it was like, I don't really know how to do that. I never was a big journaler. Like literally, if somebody journaled, I thought, what are they saying? Like, it was like, Dear Diary,
right.
Today I had pot roast. Yeah. And I was really excited because I put more onions in. And, like, what do you say?
What's so important to write down? Yeah.
Yeah. And so, there were a lot of things that came together at that point that helped me. One of them you've already mentioned was spiritual direction. And that training, it helped me slow down and it got me more curious about what's really going on in me. Because that's the way you want to work with somebody else. You want to help them slow down, invite them to rest.
So was that training a result of you trying to track all this down? Like, how do I make steps towards God in this way? Or were you just interested in it? What was
Well, I don't know that it was, it just happened maybe a few years past that, but it really accelerated my ability to sit with God. And, but it was another one of those things that came along and I knew like I wanted to grow in that way. Yeah. And so I took that opportunity and it just, when you start laying those things out, it was, the Psalms really helped me do that. Spiritual direction helped me do that. The routine of I'm going to commit to this. Like I had a friend who told me one time, I was like, how did that happen for you? And he said, I would just wake up at 6 a.m. every day and put my Bible open in my lap and say, God, if you're really here, show up. And he said, I fell back asleep most days.
Interesting.
But over a year of that routine, I just started to love the word. And so it's like, I think another thing that really helped me in that was just to start establishing a routine, which is always such a challenge to do.
Yeah, almost any routine.
Yeah.
That's new. When I think about too the doing and the being, I go back to being a kid. Like when I first heard like religion versus relationship, like I just was like thinking over that phrase, and that's something that never really went away, the difference between those two. But I feel like my tendency is to slip back into a religion side of it. Like I want God to be happy with me. I want him to look at me like a good soldier. Like I'm out there doing the good work, But that relationship is really like put, me playing music aside, put me working at a church aside, and it's just me and Jesus, like that, a relationship. I heard it since I was little, it's a relationship, not a religion. And that's still hard for me to this day, to connect with God, like we're doing right now, talking, getting to know each other. To do that with Jesus has always been just a little outside of what is comfortable or what I can access, so.
I would say for me, the words have been duty and delight. And it's always just felt like a duty to do that. And there was no delight in it. And I always thought, I want to get from duty to delight. How do I do that?
Yeah.
And the longer I've gone at this, it's both. Like it takes the routine of 3 days a week or 5 days a week or every day of the week. I'm going to get up and I'm going to do this and I'm going to commit to it. But then as I've done that, I've seen Jesus show up in ways that I wouldn't have imagined. And it's like, I can't wait to do that, even though it's early in the morning or even though it's taken 40 minutes and I really want to get into whatever with my job or whatever I need to do. I'm going to do that because like, I don't know when he really may show up and just come to life like he's sitting right next to me in a conversation. So it kind of, I fall between those two, duty and delight. Yeah.
But even just the practice of doing it over and over and over again, just like when you're learning, an instrument or a sport or whatever, it's like, it's hard at first. That shouldn't surprise you, but as you get into it, I mean, it gets easier. And like you're saying, it actually got more enjoyable, which is
isn't that funny? Because it's like the word practice. Like that's not something we wanted to do as musicians when we were kids, but we wouldn't have the joy of playing today if we hadn't learned to practice. Yeah. And it's very similar to that, the way I feel with my relationship with God.
Yeah.
I had to practice at sitting and talking to God and bringing my whole self to him and letting him know what's going on in me. And then the more you do that, the more it becomes like breathing in and out.
It's funny that you mentioned that because I'm just reflecting on, so I played piano when I was like 6 and 7 years old. I took lessons, and I hated those lessons. I hated going to her house and like sitting down and like playing the Beethoven and the Bach or whatever. But when I got an acoustic guitar and I learned Jesus Freak by DC Talk, no one had to beg me to go to my room and play. Like no one had to like, hey, don't forget to practice your, power chords. It was like I threw my bag down and ran upstairs after school and played guitar because I loved it. So like I ought to play piano. I want to play guitar. There was a big difference between those two, funny. So it's like, even when you were talking about quiet time or connecting with God or reading your Bible, there's an ought that goes along with that a lot of the times. And my desire, and it sounds like what you're describing, is that changing into a want. I want to be with Jesus. Like he's my best friend. Like he's my God. Like why wouldn't I want to just spend this time, So that transformation happens over, and it sounds like it kind of goes back and forth sometimes. Like it might, go backwards a little bit and then 2 steps forward, that kind of thing. And so I'm interested to talk about your books too, and where this all went for you in terms of like, I see you made a change, and then the spiritual direction, you start helping others that tend to their relationship with God, as you put it. What these resources that you wrote, how did that come about? You're a published author now, which is like so amazing. So like, what is all that about?
Well, it's funny you say published author. My wife's a graphic designer, and Amazon will publish anything. So I published myself
by demand.
I said one of the things that really helped me learn to bring my whole self to God were the Psalms. And that I resonate so much with the Psalms. I'll force myself to stay out of the Psalms for a while because I could just be in there every day. But there's a whole lot of other books to read and to spend time in to hear what God might say. But when I had to learn to be with God, the Psalms really helped me. And there's this quote. It's kind of a little bit longer, but I want to read it. It's from this book called "Opening to God" by Dr. David Benner, and he says, "Honesty before God is not simply avoiding lies; it's bringing our full self to God, rather than trying to fix things up before turning to God," which was a mask that I talked about. Rather than trying to fix things up before turning to God, genuine prayer is turning to God in the midst of the mess that is the reality of our inner world. It's turning to God in the midst of our confusion and doubt, our anger, our hopes, our fears, our fantasies, our pain, our coping, our defenses, our struggles, our sin, and our brokenness. There's no cure for that which most deeply ails us unless we come to God with nothing held back. And so, I think about the way I would interact with God was I wanted to bring my best to God. And there were good intentions in that. But what I didn't bring was the reality, the mess, the reality of my inner world. And the Psalms help do that. David in Psalm 6, he's like, "Oh Lord, rebuke me not in your anger, nor discipline me in your wrath. Be gracious to me, O Lord, for I'm languishing. Heal me, O Lord, for my bones are troubled. My soul is greatly troubled. How long?" David would bring this raw, brutal honesty to God. I'm weary, my moaning. I flood my bed with my tears and drench my couch with my weeping, grief and anguish and trouble. And it was just all laid out there bare in the Psalms. And so the more I sat in the Psalms, reading the Psalms, the more I was finding life and myself learning to be brutally honest with God. So it was like I learned to sit with God in the Psalms. And kind of the way that I did that is I would break down the Psalm he starts it in this way, and then this section is like this, and then the third section's like that. And so I'd break down the Psalm, what's the psalmist saying and why? And then when I saw the pattern in the Psalms, then I would start to engage God in that way. What would I say to God about that? Yeah. Or what do I have that's in front of me right now that's a trouble? When we talk about how we're made up, our heart, of our thoughts and our emotions and our desires and our choices, I learned to say, well, what am I thinking right now? And then even deeper, what feelings are going on? Well, I'm really angry. And I'm not just frustrated, I'm really angry. And I'm angry because of this. And then even deeper, when I got to my desires, what's motivating me, or what do I really long for? Or, what's causing these feelings? And then when I was able to name my thoughts and my emotions and my desires, it's that's my reality. All of a sudden I've come to my reality like the psalmist. Well, then what? Then I invite Jesus into the midst of my reality. Yeah. And so I think I lived my life a lot in the way of I've got this trouble. For me, it's kind of the worry and fear. And how do I get from worry and fear to trust? And I can't will myself to get from here and worry and fear over to here and trust. How I get to trust is invite Jesus into the midst of my worry and fear and be fully known and let him know why I'm scared. Let him know why I'm afraid, what I really long for in this. And so it's the thoughts and emotions and desires, that reality, invite Jesus into that. Then Jesus, what do we do about that? What choices do we need to make? And so that heart language that our church started developing, and the spiritual direction course, and learning to sit in the Psalms, that helped me grow my being to a point where, as I was going through the pattern and asking myself the questions that surfaced as I read and reread the text, I'm a creative person. And so I saw the opportunity to create something that somebody else might not understand how to do. Yeah. If I'm going to learn how to do this, how do I help somebody else? And that's always kind of the posture that in my heart is, I want to really help people. Yeah. And so I would get up from my prayer time with God, and I would just kind of write down the questions that I thought of. And I remember thinking, could I write this out in a book that would help people? And then the more that I just kept going through the Psalms, and this was maybe over a year, I started writing these exercises, I called them, and spiritual exercises, these books, that's what they are. They're spiritual exercises in the Psalms. And I would say they're spiritual direction in print because they help you pay attention to your relationship with God. And, like any kind of exercise, you've got to work at it. And so these are working that spiritual muscle for you to grow and to grow deeper in relationship with God. So then the more I did that, the more I just felt this, I'm going to say responsibility, but responsibility in a good way.
Not the old one.
Lowercase r.
Yeah.
Responsibility to do something with that.
Yeah.
And it was coming out of the desire of, I'd seen what God had done in my life, and I wanted to help other people grow like I'd grown.
Yeah.
And, it was a response to how I'd seen God work in my life. And so I started to put this out and, asked my wife to lay it out for me in the book and do a cover. And somebody else, a friend of mine, had done something on Amazon. I thought, gosh, this looks good. This is super easy. And I'm going to put it out there and just see what happens with it. And so that's really how the first book came about. And it's called Face to Face. And so it's 31 spiritual exercises in the Psalms that just help you bring your full self to God. Name your reality, invite Jesus into it. And what I do is I just break down the Psalm and follow the psalmist's pattern and help you ask questions that help you bring what might be hidden in the shadows in your life into the light and let you deal with God around that.
Yeah, a couple of things came to mind when you were talking. I remember when I first got to fellowship, I did one of those cohorts, with the group of guys that went, like 10 of us, went through it together. And one of the things I'd never seen before, it kind of freaks me out when I first saw it, was you get in a circle and you go around and you stand on certain papers and you start reading. And all of a sudden someone will put a chair in front of you and you're staring at this empty chair like, what is going on? What am I doing? The leader would often just say, hey, I want you to imagine Jesus is in that chair. What do you have to say to Jesus, or what do you need from Jesus? And so first time I did it was very unsettling, but then it was almost like I, had this, not an out of body experience, but like I couldn't see anyone else in the room. Yeah. Like I could just see the chair. And I was like, okay, if I'm going to do this, like I'm going to really try to do this. And so, obviously I could never get through these moments without like bawling my eyes out, but trying to speak to Jesus as if he's right in front of me, And then the other powerful side of it was, I want you to come sit in this chair. What would you say to Nate as if you were like, you've just heard what he just said to you? What do you say back to him? That was maybe the first time I had a face-to-face interaction with Jesus. And the only difference was that it was embodied. Like it was like, I've always struggled with, like, if Jesus was real, or if he was here, if he was a real man, it would be easy to have a relationship with him. My struggle is he's not. I can't see him. I can't access him. I pray and I don't hear anything back, And it was like just a moment of saying he is real and he's right in front of you in this chair. And that was such a shifting experience for me, because it can be that way all the time if we choose to look at him that way, choose to engage him in that way. And so that's what I love about this type of exercise, is it's not just like mindless prayer or just pray whatever comes to your mind. It's like following the scripture and saying, hey, like David encountered Jesus through his prayer. Like he's encountering God. He's sitting with him. He's bringing his full self, And the other thing it made me think too is like the side-by-side thing is so casual. And so like deep or hard conversations don't really exist in that scenario. Like if you're at a baseball game or at the movies or doing whatever, you don't really get into like the deep weeds of your life. It's in a personal one-on-one face-to-face conversation that those usually happen. And so I'm just sitting here reflecting, saying, if I'm side by side with Jesus in my life so much, it has a tendency to stay surfacey and just on the top level, And so, and maybe that's why the tears come, when I'm looking at an empty chair, speaking to Jesus, because that feels so vulnerable.
Yeah.
And so now I can't hide things I want to hide, and that's the doing. It's like, let me like get really good at this, and then I'll come back to you so I don't have to hide anything. I can just show you how good. But it's like you're saying, invite Jesus into that places I don't want him to see. I don't want to talk about that with you. That's the moment where intimacy is happening and there's a closeness there that he longs for. And I think we long for deep down, but you're not going to get that by just having these surfacey, you wouldn't with your father and you wouldn't with Jesus either.
Yeah. And that's that, when you bring up the chair and, talking to the empty chair, like that shifts your experience. From the side by side, or the casual, or I'm just sitting in my chair reading the Bible and the Bible's in my lap, or I'm just praying in my head, talking to God. But all of a sudden when something shifts physically and you're looking at a chair that's sitting right in front of you and imagining Jesus in that chair, and what would you say to him? It's just different. Or I've learned too, like if I say out loud what's going on and I name a sin out loud, or I tell God exactly how I'm feeling out loud, it's like all of a sudden it becomes more real than if it's just in my head. Or, you think about, if you move your posture somehow, does your heart follow? Like if I get on my knees and pray in my room by myself, as opposed to sitting in my comfortable chair, boy, my prayer is different. And there's the experience piece or experiential piece that you're describing. That's a huge shift. And, and it's getting yourself out of the comfortable, I'm just sitting next to Jesus with the word in my lap, doing what I did yesterday and the day before and the day before that. Those kind of things are disruptive in a good way.
Totally. Yeah. Do you want to talk a little bit about the other book that you did as well? Morning, Noon, and Night. What is that about?
It's really similar in the sense that it's spiritual exercises in the Psalms. But the one thing that I kind of like better about it is that I want to help people learn to pray to God. And so I unpack, an exercise for people, and then I guide them on how to talk to God. I hope that it's pressing in even more on the have an open and brutally honest conversation with God. And let me help you guide that if you struggle doing that. Yeah. So the second piece kind of added there is a guided prayer, so to speak, at the end of the exercise. Yeah. But it's 31 spiritual exercises in the Psalms. Yeah. And I loved that we used it at Fellowship last summer as part of our Psalm series, as we teach one of the Psalms and encourage people, gave them the books and go home. And I was so glad, because that's how I hope this would be used. For sure, yeah. And I love that was the idea from our teachers to do that, because I wouldn't have pushed for that, but I'm so glad, because I see how it's helped me, and I believe it can help other people. And so I'm glad that we did that. And so it helps focus more a little on praying and talking to God and how to do that and to be super brutally honest with him. Yeah, that's awesome. Well, Rob, thanks so much for coming on and talking through all this. I know getting into your story is very vulnerable, and just kind of sharing about your dad and about how, growing up was and all that. So thanks for doing that. And the other thing I would say too, of those listening, is we can get stuck. We can get in there was a moment in your story where there was a revelation from God saying, Rob, I want a relationship with you. I want to be face to face. The side by side, the doing, come to me, sit with me. There can be a resistance to that, and even when you see it going, oh man, that's going to take a lot, or that's too vulnerable, or I don't have time, to do that. I have felt that in my own life, and so I think that's the encouragement to folks that might feel that. I know something's off. I know I want more from God. The call is push into that, respond to that, and I think these two resources that you've written are great ways to do that. There's many out there, but these are two that are really meant to make a shift in your relationship with God, and even how you relate to him, sitting with God, using the Psalms to help you do that. So thanks for just walking through those two. I hope people check them out, and it's helpful to them like it helped you. And so these are both available on Amazon. Are there other places, or that's the best place to get them? That's the place to get them. Okay. And it's Face to Face and Morning, Noon, and Night. That's right. Rob Howard. That's right. Awesome, dude. Well, thanks so much for being on here. You're welcome. And we'll catch you in the next episode. Revelation Response is produced by Fellowship Bible Church and Fellowship Songs. You can check us out online at fellowshipbiblechurch.org
or by searching Fellowship Songs wherever you stream your music. Also, please leave us a like and give us a follow to hear more episodes like this. Thanks for listening.